I've been wanting to sit down with this lady for the past 3 years. I'm not kidding. And let me tell you, it did not disappoint. Jaqueline de Gernier has led teams at Twilio and DocuSign and is a mentor for women in tech at London Business School. I've always had this preconceived idea that the more senior you are, the more unapproachable you are, but that cannot be said for Jaqueline. She is one of the most generous, honest, passionate leaders I have ever met that has a huge drive to change the way people think about sales and make the industry a better place to work for everyone. In this episode, we discuss creating an inclusive workforce and cover topics such as hiring, equal opportunities, covering pay rises, promotions, reviews, and creating an inclusive culture at work. This episode is jam-packed with advice that anyone, no matter what level you are or where you are in your career, will learn something from, and I can't wait for you to listen. To start with the big question, the $1 million question, why is an inclusive culture and workforce important?
Well, I think, there's been lots of research done on this and, building diverse teams is absolutely the right thing to do. But it's actually also been proven that it's the right thing to do for business as well. Diverse businesses, diverse teams absolutely drive better results. You get different perspectives, different thought processes. You avoid that groupthink kind of mentality where perhaps there's a strategy or a process, a line of action that a team is going down where people don't necessarily want to challenge the status quo or provide a different perspective. And I think when you've got diverse teams, you can absolutely avoid that and make sure that you make better decisions with a wider spectrum of inputs into those decisions. So it's good for business. But it's absolutely the right thing to do too. We live in an age now where people should not be discouraged or have, avenues of progression closed off to them. Entirely because of their sex, because of their sexuality, because of the socio-economic group that they've come from, which I think is a topic that we don't talk about enough still as well.
Definitely, it's not just gender.
No, 100%. And there are people that are unfortunately operating in an intersection and perhaps belong to, two or more of those groups as well, where, it's even more challenging for them.
I think that's really important that you raised that, and I definitely want to address that today. We're not just speaking about gender, we are speaking about diversity throughout the whole scale, because there's so much more that you can bring to have that diversity of thought. Yeah. You've led so many brilliant teams and worked for some huge organisations in your past. How has, I guess it would be interesting to get a bit of a snapshot into your experience, and if you've ever, hit any barriers where maybe you haven't had, and not naming any names, but where you haven't had a diverse team, that it hasn't helped you grow or progress in your career or as a leader?
Yeah, I guess the overarching response that I would make to that is I've been really fortunate to work for fantastic leaders, brilliant companies that have really encouraged and celebrated diversity. And I've seen that translate into really good levels of diversity at an individual contributor level, shall we say. So if we've looked at, SDRs, MDRs, AEs in the last couple of organisations that I've worked with, I'm pleased to say, certainly as far as gender's concerned, which, because we're operating in Europe, was the one kind of metric that we were tracking. On a gender basis, we achieved parity and have 50% men and women in those teams, which was incredible. I think I shared with someone recently when I first went into tech, which was 30 years ago now. I think it was day 2 in the company that I joined. I was asked by one of the account executives to move because I was in the wrong place.
Are you joking?
And I was like, oh, sorry, I was told to sit here, and he said, no, you should be in the secretary section. And he had just assumed, because I was a woman and I was on the sales floor, that I belonged in the secretary's pool, and I had no place on the sales part of the floor. That would never happen now.
No.
And so I'm very happy to say that would never happen now. So we've made enormous progress, and it's been brilliant for me to be able to work with and lead teams where we've had that gender parity. But unfortunately, that does not translate to a senior level. And, all too often, when I go into a senior management meeting, I might be the only woman, or I might be one of a handful of women when that meeting's perhaps expanded out and includes other functions such as marketing, HR. But certainly when it's restricted to a sales leadership meeting, I'm still often, unfortunately, the only woman around that table. So that's where we've still got a lot of work to do.
Yeah, and there's definitely room for more women at that table.
100%.
And that's what I would love to get into, is it's not that you need to just compete with each other for that one spot.
No.
There is not just one spot. There's so many more spots, but we just need to open them up for people. And we'll get onto that when we speak about like having your voice and getting that confidence. It's interesting that you say that about that leadership perspective, that position, and the statistic that we found from our recent pack was that there was only 23% on average of C-suite teams are made up of women, which is just so shocking. And we are making that progress.
Yeah.
You won't be asked to move, like, thank goodness. But I guess what really makes the change is hiring, and how can we make sure that that is inclusive, that we are attracting the right candidates, and then we're also retaining that talent. So how would you suggest that people that might be watching this today create that inclusive hiring process where there are no biases?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think it's about being incredibly thoughtful at any part of the operation, whether it be hiring, whether it be promotions and performance reviews. You really have to step back and make sure that you've created a very objective process which is equitable for all. And that doesn't mean equal. It means equitable. So it might be that you have to go through some steps to really encourage your applications, or to reinforce progression for certain underrepresented groups within your organisation. So it's taking a step back and designing everything within the organisation with equity as opposed to equality in place. And that's something that the Chief People Officer at DocuSign was incredibly thoughtful about. She really did kind of drum that equitable versus equal into all of us as managers, which was really interesting. So I think when we think about hiring, the first thing is to make sure that you are attractive, to candidates that perhaps belong to underrepresented groups, and that they see you as a diverse employer, and an employer that they will want to work for, and an employer that they can really bring their whole self to. And that's a little bit chicken and egg, because if you haven't currently got a diverse team,
where do you start?
That's going to be quite difficult, but that's obviously the end goal. So it's looking at the way that your applications, your job specs and everything are written, and making sure that you're using the right terminology. I think that's something everyone does now, but going back 5-6 years, I've certainly looked at job specs for positions that I've been recruiting for, and I've seen some language that just really doesn't sit well with me. Talking about salespeople as hunters, for example, quota crushers, language that just, to be honest, doesn't resonate with me.
No.
I was a salesperson for 15 years, and
you crushed your quota, but you wouldn't say that you are a quota crusher.
Exactly. So it's going back through the language and making sure that it's not going to appeal to one. It's not even just sort of gender or sort of race. It's personality types as well, and making sure that you're appealing to the full spectrum of candidates that you want to attract. And then I would say it's about really designing an objective process, making sure that you've got trained interviewers. I'm still shocked how many times we involve members of our wider team that actually haven't gone through interview training and interview techniques.
Yeah. And
with the feedback, you hear an awful lot of subjectivity, a lot of assumptions being made. So make sure you have trained interviewers. Make sure that you have a mapped out interview process with the same questions being asked to all the candidates, and objective scorecards being used to capture the feedback and responses to those interviews. I would say always have a panel, and make sure that feedback is not being shared outside of that panel, because that can influence people with their ultimate yes or no. And challenge each other, with the feedback as well. The final thing I would say is I've seen at Twilio, we had values-based interviews. So there was a group of individuals that had been trained in the company's kind of culture and values. And Jeff Lawson, our CEO, had banned the word culture fit, because he said that was often a way for kind of hiding conscious or unconscious bias, which I think was incredibly smart. And so we had these trained values interviewers that sat in a different function. So if you were interviewing a candidate for sales, it might be someone from the finance team, for example.
Right.
And they weren't looking at sort of skills and capabilities for the role. They were looking at whether this person was in line with our values and would represent our values, and that they would add ultimately, to the culture of the organisation, as opposed to being a culture fit.
Right. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of people, when they do that culture fit interview, you've seen it happen before, where they're like, oh, could I go for a drink with this person? Could they fit in, and we could actually be friends? And it's actually, when you think about a diverse workforce, that's to your point where you need to make sure that it's attractive to everybody, that you need to have those different personality types in there. You might not go down to the pub with the person that's interviewing, but they might be the most incredible person for your team.
Completely.
And you really need to look at, do you just have, when you're thinking about diversity, not just about race and gender and neurodivergent, are you having the same person? Are they all extroverts?
Completely. Have you got a hiring manager that's essentially just hiring in the image of themselves?
Yeah, exactly.
And so, I think it's really important. That's a nice check. I think if you train your interviewers, hopefully, and you have that objective process, you should be eliminating that subconscious bias anyway. Yeah. But I think having that values-based interview is a really nice smart kind of check. Final thought on this, and there'll probably be a recurring theme here. I might mention something along these lines a few times. If you are in the process of building diverse teams, and you've got one or two individuals in your team who belong to an underrepresented group at the moment, you're almost certainly going to want to use them as an interviewer so that you can, encourage people to want to join the company and join the team and feel like they have that sense of belonging. Think about how you can reward and recognise the time input that those interviewers are going to have to give. Because I know as a female sales leader that I have been asked, in the last 2 or 3 companies to do a disproportionate number of interviews when compared to my male colleagues. And I'm happy to do that because I absolutely want to play my part in encouraging as many women to join the team as possible. But it's yet another overhead, yet another burden that I'm carrying that other members of the team may well not be carrying. So again, it's putting me at a potential disadvantage.
Yeah.
So I'd really encourage people to think about that.
That's really interesting. But you also don't want to feel like the token person on the interview panel.
No, that's true too.
How do you navigate that?
Oh, that's a tough one actually, isn't it? I think it's got to feel authentic ultimately. I think if you're working in an organisation where you do just feel like the token, sort of member of the panel, that speaks to probably much wider, issues within that organisation that you would need to sort of question and ultimately try and change. These are all so helpful, Jaqueline. Thank you so much for sharing your advice. So we've got them in, we've done the inclusive hiring process. Now I want to talk about equal opportunities. It's something that I'm really passionate about, making sure that everybody, when we talk about equality, it is about equal opportunities. It's not that somebody deserves it more than others, that we've discussed so many times within Making Moves, our community, of women shouldn't just be the token hire just to fill a quota. It should be because they deserve their job. And when you're talking about promotions and pay rises, exactly the same goes for that. If you've done a good job and you deserve that promotion and pay rise, then you should get it. But there is a lack of confidence in people asking for those pay rises. From a sales leader's perspective, what advice would you give people that maybe are in that role, that feel like they're not necessarily being seen and getting that promotion that they deserve? Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think being really clear on what skills are required for the progression path that you're looking to follow, and having really open, clear conversations with your hiring manager, with others in the organisation that can help help coach you, sponsor you for those roles when they become available. So I think you're being super clear that that's the progression path that you want to follow. Understanding, if this is where I am today and that's where I want to get to, where are the gaps? How can I work on those gaps ahead of time so that when that opportunity comes up, I'm going to be front of the queue for it. And so I think there are things that you can do as an individual, but I actually think there's an awful lot the organisation needs to do. I think there's, as you say, we've done a great job of building pipeline. And like I said, in a couple of organisations, we've hit, certainly for gender, we've hit gender parity. why is that then not translating to a senior level? So I think where we need to focus our efforts is on this topic. It's on promotions, it's on progression, it's on performance reviews. So I think from the organisation's perspective, they really need to have the same rigour and approach to designing formal objective processes for promotions and pay reviews as they have for the hiring process. Whereas what you often see, I'm glad to say I've not seen it in DocuSign and Twilio, and I can talk about my experience there. But what you often hear is that there's taps on shoulders, for promotions. Pay reviews are based on, quite subjective opinions of people's performance and what they contribute. And people aren't coming back to the data. They're not doing, 360 reviews, etc. I think having really formal lockdown processes, making sure that those are data driven. Something I saw work really well at Twilio was we had a rigorous calibration process around performance reviews, and pay awards were linked to the performance reviews as well, which I think is key. And as a management team, and this basically went every level of the organisation, so the senior leadership team would sit down and do exactly the same. But as a management team, we would sit down and look at the reviews and the rankings of the people in our team, and we would make sure we would challenge each other. And we would say, well, why have you given this person, an outstanding? If I look at their KPIs that they drove, those KPIs actually are on a par with this person who you gave a significant. So what was the difference there? And you basically get them to justify the difference. And sometimes you would be in agreement as a result of that. Other times, and we'd always have an HR professional kind of in those meetings. Other times, that would be downgraded to a significant. Yeah. So it was a really, really nice way of creating some checks and balances and making sure that we were always bringing it back to the KPIs and that individual was responsible for, and that any subjectivity, any kind of favouritism wasn't being allowed to creep in.
And it's clear as well. Yeah. You can see it. You're like, well, doesn't add up, so there's no way that you can get around that.
Completely. And it means when an individual comes to you and says, what do I need to do to get to this position, or why did this person get that progression and I didn't, you can be super, super clear, because everything has been created in these progression paths and in the performance review gradings.
You've been incredibly lucky, Jaqueline, that you've worked for some organisations that are very open to those discussions, that listen, that actually champion that, and that you have a voice and a seat at the table in that room. So many people that are listening to this today probably aren't in that same situation, whether they are an IC, maybe really frustrated that their management aren't listening to them, or whether they are in a management position, whether they are male or female, or anybody in the organisation where they really feel passionately that things should change. Yeah. And it's tough. Yeah. And I know that there's not an answer, but is there any advice that you could give from what you've seen throughout colleagues or in the industry that people could use and take away to have those tough conversations, to kind of turn the wheel a little bit with it?
Yeah, completely. And you're right, it is tough, and there's no perfect answer to this, I guess. The first thing I would suggest, and I hate always putting the onus on the individual, because I really feel like the onus for the solutions here is on the organisations.
Yeah, it should be.
But if you are in an organisation that has got a lot of work to do still in this area, I think create your support network around you, not just internally at that organisation. I would, join networking groups, reach out to individuals that perhaps you see, on LinkedIn, who have got a great presence, who resonate with you, and you recognise that they perhaps are on a similar path to you and perhaps experiencing similar challenges, and create that kind of support network so that you've got a sounding board, so that you can swap, ideas and advice with each other. I've certainly got people that I've mentored, in the past, who have reached out to me, saying, this is the situation I'm in at the moment, I'm feeling a bit stuck, and I'm always happy to share. And if that can be helpful,
your DMs are going to be flooded after this episode gets released.
If it helps people to progress their career and to make sure that they get equal opportunities, then that's absolutely fine by me. So I think create that network, because it is hard to keep resilient in those situations. And then where those formal processes and that objectivity doesn't exist, try and create it yourself. Try and own that. have those conversations with your manager, create relationships, perhaps with their manager, ask for a skip level meeting, make sure that you've got those internal sponsors, and try and wrap a process around those conversations where one perhaps doesn't exist, and make sure that you're coming to those performance reviews with a very clear documented track record of how you've performed against your KPIs, any other areas where you're contributing to the business, the sorts of things that go unnoticed sometimes.
And it's tough to promote yourself, especially being British.
Yes.
People they feel so uncomfortable saying that they're proud of themselves for things, but it's so important. There's a difference between gloating and just being proud and showing your boss
completely
what you've done. So that is really important.
Well, I think that's where creating those internal sponsors can be really helpful as well, because I think that's definitely an area that I've struggled with in the past, and I think you tend to if you come from an underrepresented group. You don't want to be that one person in the room kind of, going on and on about, your accomplishments. Whereas, I think, if you're in the majority of a group in a room, that brings with it, some inherent confidence, and perhaps you do feel a bit more comfortable, speaking up about your successes and your accomplishments. So I think, build those internal champions. Make sure that they are helping to shine a light on the successes where you perhaps might feel a little bit uncomfortable. And where, for senior champions as well, it's really useful to know that you've got someone in the room when those pay discussions and promotion discussions are happening that perhaps can speak up on your behalf. Yeah, you've mentioned 2 words there, sponsors and champions.
Yeah. We've also got mentors.
Yeah.
So what's the difference? Because you have you're very passionate about sponsorship versus mentorship.
Yeah.
How would you define that?
Yeah. So I think mentors have a really important critical role to play, and I think that's where you perhaps have a relationship with someone that's more senior than you, that's in the type of role that you aspire to have. Could be internal, could be external, or perhaps there's something else about their kind of experience that you really want to tap into that you think's of value. Hugely, valuable. I think, there's an absolute place for mentorship. I think if we think about diversity and inclusion and we look at, why aren't we perhaps seeing, the numbers that we want to see at a senior level for underrepresented groups, if we constantly just bring it back to mentoring, I think the implication there is that it's a skills gap issue. And I think we're all agreed that it's not a skills gap issue.
No.
So I think creating the internal sponsors and the internal network for those individuals is key. And I think it's key because, unfortunately, we still have a disproportionate amount of white men in senior positions in most of the organisations that we're operating in. And, people tend to hang out with and chat with people that sound and look a lot like them. So I think there's just this informal network that exists for junior white men that perhaps isn't there for other underrepresented groups. And despite all of the kind of objective processes and organisational design that we might, create, it's really difficult to overcome those informal networks. So that, I think, is a really simple place where we can really focus to make sure that everyone has access to those opportunities and to those coaches. And I've certainly been, a voice in a room when promos and pay reviews were being discussed, where I was able to put a very different perspective forward on behalf of someone that I was a coach and sponsor for. And I don't think they would have got their promotion if I hadn't have been in the room at the time. So I've actually seen the power of that.
That's so amazing. So sponsors are something that your organisation would almost, is it like creating an ERG, like a group of people that want to be sponsors? Or is it just like an informal thing?
Well, we didn't have a formal sponsoring. We had a mentoring program at Twilio. I guess the reason, same at DocuSign, the reason why I think this is a pet topic of mine, I did some study with Insead on leading diversity programs. I think as a woman in sales, as a woman in tech, I was being asked to join ERG, speak at internal events and be on panel discussions, etc. And yes, I've got my own personal experience being, a female in a male-dominated environment, but I didn't really feel like I had the vocabulary And I just wanted to go deeper and make sure that, I had a really well-defined, well-thought-through kind of point of view on the topic. So I spent some time studying on this Insead course. It was incredible. And I just remember hearing one of the lecturers, she was talking about, this implicit underlying, theme of mentorship, which is that it's on us. And if we just work that little bit harder, try that little bit harder and develop our skills a little bit more, then we can break through that ceiling. God. And she was just so angry on the topic and was like, no, what we need is internal sponsors. And so that really landed.
You can't work much harder.
No, exactly.
We're doing everything.
It can't be all on the individual. No. It has to be on the organisational design and structures and processes that are put in place, and then you can change the mindsets.
That's fantastic. Insead.
Yeah.
So it's a course that anyone can do.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. Yeah, the one that I did focused primarily on gender diversity, but much the same as this discussion, they were always broadening the conversation out. There were perhaps some things that they were covering that were probably, more useful for driving gender diversity. But the key takeaways, I think, were equally applicable if you look at all kind of underrepresented groups.
I think it's so important for companies to promote courses like that for everyone to take.
Yeah.
And I also don't think it should just be down to the leadership team to take. I think people within the business that feel passionate about this, that want to be allies, that want to have a voice and a say in it, because ultimately everyone is building that culture. And when we speak about building that inclusive workforce, it, yes, of course, needs to come from the top, but if your whole company are not on board and are not behind it, then you're not truly going to change the way that your 100%. Company is. So I definitely think, I will have a look into that. But that program that you did gave you a brilliant vocabulary. You're able to sit here and eloquently speak about it. And I'm already learning so much. But for people that are wanting to learn more about this topic, that are wanting to help, there is this fear, and I've spoken to so many people about it, they would rather not say anything than say the wrong thing and mess up because they don't necessarily feel like they're educated on that topic enough. How can we break that? Without obviously to the obvious as taking courses, but what would you tell people to do?
It's a great question. Well, number one, do take courses. And to be clear, that was something that I, invested in and did purely, as an individual without any sponsorship from my company, because I felt like it was really important. If I'm being asked to stand on a stage and talk about, what we could be doing to attract more women into tech, then I really want to make sure I can do the best possible job there. But I think ideally having companies also offering courses and sponsorship would be key. I think it just comes down to education, just educating yourself, speaking to individuals, in your network, saying, I'd like to be an ally. I feel like I'm pretty well versed on some of the challenges that I face as a woman in tech. But, I believe you might face different challenges, if you've got somebody, in your team who perhaps, has a different sexual orientation or, whatever their unique perspective might be. Have those conversations. But I think arm yourself with information, educate yourself. If you're lucky enough to have a diversity and inclusion team, speak to them, and ask them, if they can point you in the direction of different books and courses as well. And I'm sure they would love to have that conversation. But I think it just comes down to arming yourself with as much information as possible.
Definitely. And also we are humans. So if you do mess up, as long as you've done it with good intent and you want to learn and ask questions, then I think you need to cut yourself some slack with some things.
I agree. We did some really nice lunchtime sessions actually at Twilio that were spearheaded by our D&I team, but were run very much on a kind of, local kind of team level. We purposefully mixed, people signed up to the courses, but we made sure that it was very mixed. So you didn't end up with, everyone from one function or from one office location. And it was a safe space. And those sessions were very much focused on race. And it was a really safe space for people to share kind of what their own individual experience was. And perhaps for those of us that were, didn't understand those challenges at a detailed level, to sit and listen and to learn, and then to be able to be, an ally and a supporter as much as possible. And the feedback on those sessions was incredible. It really broke down some barriers.
Oh my gosh, we've done a couple of those sessions. They are so difficult to listen to, and I've spoken on them before. Like, it's very much open to the whole business, and people can come on and share their stories. And do you know, when you're given that opportunity from your business to be able to speak openly about a topic like this, you feel seen, you feel like your company actually care about hearing your story. And it's just amazing to see people just listen and come to you afterwards and say, thank you for sharing that.
Completely.
Because it's these topics and these stories that people face daily. You're not just going to have someone walk up to you at your desk and be like, oh, by the way, so this is how I feel about the workplace.
Completely.
And it sometimes takes your management to put sessions on like that for people to be able to feel like they're able to bring their full selves to work.
100%. And the more you hear those stories and you hear about those experiences, you know, sort of the more empathy you can have, you know, for others. So I couldn't agree more. I think really powerful and a nice way of broadening it out as well, because I think otherwise it will always fall to the more senior leaders who perhaps fall into those groups to constantly be doing those sessions, to be showing their vulnerable side, to be sharing their experiences. And, you know, that can get draining. It really can. So I think the more that you can have that happening, you know, across the different teams and business, the better.
100%. Could not agree more. Jaqueline, thank you so much for the conversation today. It has been so interesting. I have literally taken mental notes. I'm going to go back and watch this recording and write it all down. I'm sure all of our listeners at home have really taken so much value from what you've said today, and you're doing some incredible work. So thank you for sharing. But on the last note that you mentioned around vulnerability and this being called Sales Unfiltered, we really want to show the ups and downs of the sales industry and the fact that not every day is great. There are challenges that everybody face, and I'm sitting down with so many incredible guests on this channel. And I think there's something really special and unique about hearing about other people's challenges that they faced in their career. So what failure or challenge have you faced that's really shaped you to where you are today?
Yeah, and I think it probably picks up on that final point, to be honest, around resilience. You know, I've often been one of the only female senior leaders in the organisations that I've worked with. And I think that brings with it, you know, a certain kind of overhead in terms of your emotional kind of energy on a day-to-day basis, which can be a little bit draining. I've also been one of the few working mums, I'm afraid to say. And so, you know, my children are now, well, my daughter's going to be 14 tomorrow and my son's
amazing.
17.
Happy birthday.
Thank you.
To her, not to you.
Pass
that message on.
And to me.
You're the mum.
So they're a bit older now, and, you know, still full on, but definitely a bit easier to juggle. But when they were younger, it was tough. It was really difficult juggling all of the demands of being a working mum. My husband works full time as well. And I think I really burnt myself out. And I knew that ultimately it was going to be worth it. I knew that I wanted to have a career and I have ambitions and, you know, I wanted to progress my career, and I knew that I just needed to really knuckle down and kind of get through this period. And thankfully, with a lot of support from my husband, from a couple of amazing nannies that we've had, and just from the family network around us, we got through it. Amazing. But it certainly wasn't without, you know, some burnout, shall we say, along the way. And I have to say, COVID and the acceptance of flexible working, of remote working, has been an absolute game changer. So I really, really hope that, you know, other, not just working mums, but working parents, you know, don't have to go through some of the experience that I went through, and can have a more enjoyable journey. So that would be probably the biggest challenge that I've had to work through.
And there's no regrets. You're happy you did it.
Oh, 100%.
Amazing.
I mean, I think what drives me there as well, and I've only realised this recently, but my mum, she actually worked in radio, like yourself. So she worked for BBC Radio News in London. In the 70s, absolutely loved
hit her up.
Yeah,
maybe we're pals.
Oh, she loved that. And she gave her career up when she had me. She just couldn't find a way of being able to juggle the two. And, you know, I just love to know who that woman would have been if she'd have been able to have carried on in that career. whilst also being a mum. You know, I love my mum dearly, she's amazing, but I just feel like there's so much more that she could have done, you know, in her career if she'd have been given the opportunity to. So definitely. I think that's one of the things that drives me.
You should not have to give up what you love.
No.
And your identity and your job and your career and something that you've worked so hard at just to have a family.
Yeah.
Of course, your family is beautiful and you're so happy and proud that you've got them. But I'm so glad that you stuck to it and that you were able to juggle both your career, because mums can be working mums. They can be successful. We need to do a whole nother episode on
there we go
on being a working mum and maternity and everything.
Yeah.
But I guess what one final question is aside from that working from home element that you mentioned there, which I think is brilliant and probably the best thing to come out of COVID, that you've got that flexibility. Is there anything else as a working mum that you wish that you saw more? Because there's a lot around like compensation, being in a sales role and maybe not getting your commission whilst you're on maternity. That's a huge talking point that we have women telling us. But is there anything else?
There's definitely some things around that. I think returning to work as well. I've had a returning to work mum in the past where I've had to really work hard to make sure that they got guaranteed commission when they returned, because obviously they were walking into a territory with zero pipeline. It was much the same as being, a day one, member of the team again.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot you can do to wrap support financially, but also in terms of the working environment, the working hours, etc., to support people and really set them up for success. Because unfortunately, getting people to return after they've had children is only part of the
stats are crazy. People just drop off. They're like, it's just not worth it.
It's really difficult. It's really tough balancing and getting the childcare right. There's a lot of tweaking that has to be done in those first early years. So I think there's a lot there for sure where, employers can definitely step up and do more.
Amazing. Well, Jaqueline, I'm sure you're a huge inspiration to your kids, and they're going to love the fact that you've had your career, and you're going to be a great role model for them, and sponsor maybe for their career for the future. But thank you so much for joining us today. I really enjoyed this conversation. If you're interested in reading our Making Movements Insights pack that I've mentioned a couple of statistics that we done when we surveyed the industry, we'll pop the link in the show notes in the comments below. I feel like a proper YouTuber by saying that, but gotta link it. But thank you so much, and we'll see you guys next week. Thanks so much for listening. Check out the channel for more episodes like this one, and we'll see you next week.